Okay, this would be the Trauma Informed 101. This is from the city of Chicago. They want some of you guys already been through this training. This is kind of learn about different trauma things related to trauma. So it'd be me and Whitney. Um, so so the first slide. Oops, this slide. Whitney, it's gonna be a couple seconds till I figure out how
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
to switch it over. Oops, no. Here we go.
Okay. All right. So before we get started, this is our engagement agreement. So basically, our time together is limited. We can't address everything, but Steve and I kind of came up with what we thought was most important to discuss. Let's keep conversations focused on the topics. Confidentiality is a priority. So if you share anything during our presentation, let's keep it to the presentation, I guess. It's a safe, judgment-free zone, so we respect each other as we are. Please keep crosstalk to a minimum. I don't think we have to deal with that here. There are never any wrong answers or dumb questions, and participation is essential. Okay, so I guess this is just emphasizing the importance of self-care, taking care of ourselves. If you ever feel like you need to take a break, take the time you need and practice mindfulness. So especially with, when you're working on trauma or working with people that have gone through trauma, it's kind of a lot sometimes. So take it at your own pace.
So this comes from the Healthy Chicago 2.0. This is the mayor's initiative a little while back to try to make sure that every area of Chicago is kind of trauma informed. And this means kind of having a basic understanding of what trauma is and the effects it has on people.
Okay, and for our first module, which is on stress and trauma, the objectives are that we are going to be defining what stress is, defining trauma. We're going to review examples of trauma and discuss outcomes of stress and trauma.
So this slide kind of says that 25% of people kind of identify as having high or young American women and parents experience high level of stress with probably since COVID, it probably went way, way higher than that. 50% of Americans believe they have stress, 33 believe that there's higher than healthy levels, and 64% of Americans say major stress comes from financial uncertainty. And since we have like COVID and stuff, that is probably a lot higher now, I bet. And so many people being out of work. Oops. And so here's some different examples. There's positive stress, which positive stress is like kind of like things where you can kind of feel that you can handle. Then there's kind of like stress, but you can still feel like it's like kind of like normal thing, kind of part of your life, and that's what's called positive stress. It's stuff that's not going to totally destroy you, but it's going to be like you believe that you can handle it. Tolerable stress is stuff where it's like really traumatic, but it's stuff where you can still kind of make it through and feel like, okay, this is something that I can handle, even though it's really kind of upsetting, hard and stuff like that. I can still handle it. Toxic stress is what they kind of when stuff is so you just feel like you cannot handle it at all and you cannot tolerate it, that is not going you're not going to be able to make it through it. And those are the three different types of stress.
Okay, so what is trauma? Individual trauma results from an event or series event or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. This is SAMHSA's concepts of trauma, the 3 E's in trauma. So you have, what they talk about there is the event, and then experiencing the event, and then the after effect. But as you can see with the arrows, it can kind of go, there's not necessarily a starting point sometimes, and it kind of keeps going around in the circle because you kind of need to work through the trauma. It's not going to go away on its own.
And there's different types of trauma. Sometimes a trauma can come in different forms. Sometimes it's just a single event. And that can just be something just like a one-time event, what you also only happens and then it's kind of done with. And it doesn't, and then there's complex trauma, which is like kind of like domestic violence, homelessness. It could be sexual molestation, different things like that. Then there's what kind of goes on and on and on for people. Another type of trauma is collective trauma, and that can be genocide, it could be war, it could be racism, discrimination, and it's kind of stuff what a whole group of people go through. What was really kind of cool or interesting was I was talking to a person from another country, and he was talking about the collective trauma they all went through, and it was just like really fascinating about kind of like what kind of happened and the kind of the effects of it, and just kind of like the impact it had on them. Historical is kind of like Holocaust, slavery, internment of Japanese Americans, stuff what might have happened in the past, but still might have effect on you today. And secondary trauma, this might be is stuff what we might be hearing the clients talking about, like a traumatic event what happened in their lives, and you kind of feel the same amount. You kind of feel like the after effects of it. You feel like hearing their story can kind of make you feel like get that a whole. You can actually be re-traumatized just by hearing another person's story. And is one of the different things about the types of trauma is it's not saying that any one of these are has any greater impact or less impact on people. It could be like a single event. It can just be as traumatic as a complex event. It can have long-lasting effects on a person. So it's not like saying that any of these things are a lesser trauma, but it still can have a lot of effects, and you can still get those negative effects of trauma. And here's some of the negative effects of trauma. 40 health issues and 8 causes of death can be linked to stress. And trauma impacts more than just the individual. A lot of times, like trauma can impact, like a person went through trauma. A person might experience a trauma, and it might impact their whole family. It can be, it can kind of like impact generations. For example, like if a person went through a lot of trauma where they might not trust being in the presence of men, that can get actually passed down to their children, that they might not be feel safe around men or whatever. So it can kind of like a lot of times trauma kind of gets passed down to generation to generation. And some communities are disproportionately affected. And cultural and historical oppression and environmental stress. And what was kind of neat about that is, or interesting about that is, I had a friend who was doing like a study on the Green Line, and if the farther you go on the Green Line away from the city, there's a substantially life expectancy falls down as the farther you go away from the Green Line, because and they kind of contributed that to the lack of health cares and a lot more stressful in the low-income neighborhoods. And intertransitional transmission of trauma and coping, or intergeneration transmission of trauma and coping. And that kind of goes like, kind of what I kind of mentioned before, is like it can be kind of passed down.
Is this one mine? Oh, no, that's you.
This is interesting. Okay, Okay, sorry, this didn't appear up in my little PowerPoint, but we can go through it really quickly. Impacts of trauma, these are kind of all the different impacts that trauma can be. As a person can be feeling emotionally overwhelmed, loss of safety, loss of danger cues, which is kind of interesting. Is like if a person can go through a lot of trauma, they might lose the sense of what's dangerous and what's not dangerous. And it can kind of like, and it can be like loss of intimacy. A lot of people who have been experienced like rape and things, they might have a lot of trouble experience like typical reactions to sex. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about that section? Okay, great. We can go to the next section then.
Okay. So this next module is on adverse childhood experiences. So our objectives are to gain knowledge of the ACE study, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, major findings and dose response, to understand adverse community environments and adverse collective historical experiences, and to become aware of ACEs as important underlying factors for childhood and adult physical, emotional, and social health problems.
And so with the ACEs, the more adverse community the more adverse childhood experience you have is a lot more times, like it kind of starts down. If you see like this thing kind of goes down and shows like the different events of like poverty, racism, discrimination, any kind of trauma the person might experience, and they'll have, like when people have a lot of those experience, they'll have more experience in the later life in domestic violence, substance abuse, experience different abuse, mental illness, and so forth. So it's kind of like trauma kind of roots us into what is kind of like a predictor of what we're gonna experience in later on in life if it's not handled well.
All right, so these are the major findings of the ACEs study. Says ACEs are common. 50% of adults have one or more adverse childhood experiences. 25% have 3 or more, and 6% have 6 or more. The amount of ACEs you have matters, because the higher amount of adverse childhood experiences that an individual has, the higher population risk, or what Steve was talking about, is kind of more traumatic events happening throughout their life. And there's a strong relationship between disease, disability, social, and productivity. ACEs are the most powerful known influence or predictor of health. So if you have, I remember talking about that. So like if you've had a lot of adverse childhood experiences, more trauma in your life, that means you may have a higher stress level. So you might have a higher chance of having like hypertension or diabetes, potentially behavioral problems. It kind of all goes hand in hand. So that's why it's so important to get like help if you need help for your trauma.
And this chart kind of shows you like what Whitney just said, is that if you look at this, you see the red part. These are people who have ACE scores who have 4 or more experienced 4 or more major traumas in their childhood, and it kind of has things what you don't even think that would be related to trauma, like kidney disease. Like kidney disease, it doesn't seem like that would be related to trauma at all. Arthritis, and it's like all these different things have been shown to be linked to like stress, and that's where you can see like the ACE scores, what people have, and the amount of prevalence of that disease. And it's just, as you can see, it kind of goes higher and higher. And the same with mental health too. If you look at the chart to the right, the mental health, there's 51.5% that if you have 4 or more traumas in your childhood, that you can have mental health problems. And this page kind of goes down to like actually on our job performance too. People who have a lot of trauma in their life, they're likely to have more absenteeism, serious financial problems, and serious job problems. So a lot of times our work performance is actually related to the trauma that we experience in our lives.
Okay. And then this is the iceberg. It says it's a tool for guiding systemic thinking. So the first being events, what just happened, which is kind of still above the water, because with an iceberg, they always talk about there's so much more than what you're seeing, so much more going on. So that's a react. Then from the events, it says patterns, trends, what's been happening. Have we been here or someplace similar before with the event that happened? So then there's this anticipation kind of to react. You're kind of, it reminds me of kind of like being freaked out that something's about to happen. So you're anticipating it. Underneath is systemic structures. So what are the forces at play contributing to these patterns? Is there a design in society for these types of patterns to happen? And then at the very bottom, there's mental models. How does our thinking allow this situation to persist? And that can be kind of transformative. Okay. I love this one. So they say, rather than what's wrong with you, the relevant question should be what happened to you. And I think that this is so important, especially as a social worker. I remember learning in school that, instead of saying that that's a schizophrenic person, we're person-centered, person first. So before anything, that is a person who may have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but that person is not just their diagnosis. So I think that's really empowering. Okay. All right. So we have a narrative, and then we have a couple questions that we wanted to ask. So I'll read it. So the narrative one says, and this isn't real. We just made this up. So you go to work and you have a coworker, Jill. You go to work and a coworker, Jill, is telling you that the supervisor likes everyone but them. Jill says that she feels picked on and held at a different standard than everyone else. You have worked with Jill every day and you do not see the supervisor engaging in any of these activities. So our first question is, why do people have different impressions of the same situation? Does anyone want to answer that? Okay. Well,
I could make a comment.
Yeah, go for it.
Why do people have different impressions of the same situation? Maybe due to low self-esteem.
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely. Being kind of, we talk about sometimes being sensitive, hypersensitive.
Yeah.
If you've gone through a lot, you might feel like sometimes that everyone's picking on you.
Right.
Because you're right. That's great. Yet that your self-esteem might be low and that it does seem like you're being treated differently. And maybe you are, and maybe you're not. I don't know. And then why does trauma create these different experiences and alter perceptions? I guess I kind of talked about that a little bit with what I was saying.
Let someone answer.
Yeah.
Who would like to answer?
Remember, there's no wrong answers.
Hey, Bernice, can you answer? Or Liz?
Well, I would say everybody reacts to trauma differently. So depending upon, the severity of the trauma, the extent of the trauma, how you react, how your personal psychology, biology, self-esteem at the time, reacts to the trauma, it's gonna determine, the severity of it. So when you go through a similar, experience, it might bring up some of those same, feelings, and maybe a person that hasn't had that trauma, they're not going to feel the same way, or a person, they might have even had that same trauma, but their initial reaction to the trauma is different. So a lot of times people, somebody will say, well, my parents, weren't fair to me. And somebody's like, oh, everybody's parents aren't fair to them. So what's minimal to one person, might be really severe to somebody else. So we can't, like, breaking up, somebody might easily be able to break up with people in relationships and they can deal with it. For other people, it's,
Devastating.
so it varies from person to person. So you just don't know. And then they're going to react to those new experiences in a different way.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay,
Is
does
there any-
anybody have any questions, comments?
I have a comment.
Mhm.
The thing what you said that, what's wrong with you, and the better thing would say, well, what happened to you? Those both sound the same thing. They both sound alike to me.
Well, I think when you say what's wrong with you, it's almost like you're pointing at someone and you're telling them that something's wrong with them, that inherently there's, that they are lacking. So it's, instead of putting blame on the person, if you say what happened to you, it's saying that there's experiences that may have been out of their control to have impacted them, and it's not just that there's something wrong with them.
Okay.
Does that make more sense? It's really just about kind of like, even with how you talk to someone, like I always said when I'd work with people, I'd say, I'm not going to come in here and just say, what's wrong with you? I want to know what's going on in your life and what's your opinion of what's going on. Because if you say someone, has depression, you're like, that's just a depressed person. They might have depression, but they're still, like a mother or a friend, or they're still happy sometimes. So it's not allowing the trauma to take over the person, I guess.
Yes. And I think sometimes it's like about like just kind of looking deeper into a person. It's not like kind of judging them by the surface, but kind of like all the stuff might have been just because someone has a behavior, not kind of looking at like just the behavior, but it might be an awkward behavior, but it's a pattern what kind of was learned throughout their lives.
Actually, that brings up, Liz and I have talked before about, when we're having these housekeeping referrals, and it's easy to initially just say, this person's just a really dirty or messy person. I don't know what, and just kind of prejudging instead of looking back and saying, I wonder what's going on in their life. Maybe they're so stressed out by something else that they're not able to focus on cleaning up after themselves. So I think it is important to kind of step back and say, let's look at this whole situation, not just the one behavior.
Is there any other questions? Okay, our next part is module 3 is biological, and the objectives of this part is to understand the impact of experience, both negative and positive, on our body and our brain, understand how trauma disrupts all aspects of our development, and learn the dominant response types.
All right. So how our brain functions. The top layers or the cortex, they're calling the thinking brain. So that would be, am I thinking clearly? Then there's the emotional state, which is the limbic system is in control of that. And that's, am I nurtured? And then the survival state or the brainstem is, am I safe? Okay, so it says, oh, yeah. Okay. If a person does not feel safe and nurtured, they cannot think clearly. So if there's, you might say like there's like a kid might have some abuse going on at home. So they don't feel safe going home. So they come to school and they might be acting out in school and they can't focus and they're getting bad grades. And it's because they don't feel safe or nurtured. It impacts, I can't focus or learn, work problems. You cannot self-regulate. You might get fired from work, involvement with law enforcement, divorce, substance abuse. There might be anger problems coming out when really in that situation as a kid, they're really sad and they don't know how to react, because maybe they haven't been taught how to, and they're used to seeing violence and stuff like that going on. So there's signals sent from the brain to the body are dysregulated, which can cause disease if you're not able to really like self-regulate, and different trauma turns into illness and etc.
Okay, and so our body has a kind of like a ways to react to trauma. Sometimes it's called fight, flight, or freeze. So in a flight thing is you kind of just want to run away from it. In a fight thing, you can see like the person tries to kind of like to battle it, and freeze things, they just kind of stop and do nothing. And what's kind of neat, interesting about this is everybody has kind of like their same little patterns. So you see like if you were in school and you got into tons of fights, you probably have the fight pattern. If you when you get like if you walking and stuff and you if something traumatic or something happens, you also need to just kind of stand still, also cannot move at it, whatever, you probably has a freeze pattern. And if you run away right away, it's a flight pattern. And we kind of like this response is kind of immediate and instinctive. So every one of us probably has like kind of a different pattern. Have anybody ever noticed how they react to trauma? Because like for me, I think I'm a freezer. If something traumatic happens, I just stand there. If there's something like I'm like, okay, I'm in danger. Okay, I just kind of freeze. I just kind of stand there. I kind of like process the situation before I decide what to do. Has anybody ever noticed anything about themselves, how they kind of react to different situations in life? And it might not even be severe trauma. It could just be like an ordinary situation.
Maybe a lot of stress, or I'm the same way, the freeze, like I've been in situations where it's like you think you're alone and then all of a sudden like the door slams shut or something, or you hear a noise and you're by yourself. I'm the same way where I just kind of freeze and I got to process it. So.
I have a reaction to stress and where I get busy. I get right in there and start making choices and plans and trying to figure out what's the solution. So that's my reaction to I guess that's the fight part of the fight syndrome.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I tend to do both. I tend to do fight and freeze. I have a little bit of a combination of both. I tend to kind of like Trina. I get real busy and I like to kind of make things happen and keep it moving. But sometimes I can just shut down and freeze and just do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
And I'm evaluating the situation, so I'm getting ready to fight, I guess.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, like we all kind of have like different patterns, and there's no really a right pattern to have. So there's not, is just because you're like might be a freezer or a fighter or a flighter, one pattern is not better than the other. Just how like it's just kind of instinctual. Okay. The next one is kind of like how traumatic events kind of affect us. And what's kind of neat about this a lot of times is that people have a tendency to when they get a lot of trauma and stress in their life, they kind of have a tendency to kind of either go into it's called um, sympathetic and parasympathetic, where like you see some people when like especially like is really interesting is that you see some people who they might went through a lot of trauma and they'd be like really hyper all the time. Even like years later after the trauma, they'd be like really hyper. They might have a lot of times they might have like a lot of they might be always wide awake, really just can never seem to relax. They can just be like going 100 miles per hour from their trauma. And there might be another and they might like sometimes it's not really put here, but sometimes like hypersexual sex too, is they might gone through a lot of trauma and they might be always like really having a lot of like really hypersexual too. The other thing is another person might go through a trauma and they'll be constantly depressed. They'll be sleeping all the time. They won't have enough energy to do anything. They just lay in their bed all the time. And it was kind of interesting about that. And that's called like trauma. People have a tendency to either be fall on one, how they react to it. They'll be either way up or they'll be way down. Some people bounce around, but in my experience, most people, they kind of have like kind of a go-to place where they kind of go to. They either get like when they experience a lot of trauma, they all suddenly are a lot of stress. They kind of go into to a state where they kind of sleep all the time or they do something else. Okay, is there any questions or anything about that little section? Okay. Oops. Okay, Whitney?
Oh, sorry. Okay, so module 4 is we're going to be talking about protective factors and risk factors. The objectives are to define risk and protective factors and positive experiences with helping systems. Okay. Okay, so risk factors are not predictive factors due to protective factors. Risk factors increase the likelihood of exposure to adversity and negative outcomes. So that would be there's factors that make it you more highly likely to go through some sort of traumatic event or something. And especially that would be like when we talked about having the 4 or more childhood traumatic experiences. Protective factors, on the other hand, lower the likelihood of problematic outcomes or reduces the negative impact of a risk factor. So that means you might have a lower chance of going through the trauma, but if you do go through the trauma because of these protective factors, you might be able to cope better with it.
Okay. And one of the different things about how a person really kind of accepts trauma in their lives is called resilience. And that doesn't mean that a person, just because a person is resilient does not mean that they don't experience the stress, but it means that they are better prepared for the stress and they're able to cope with the negative effects of stress. So if you look at that, when we're talking about like the one chart, so a person who is resilient, they might not experience falling asleep all the time or sleeping all the time when they have stress. people can kind of become at different times of their life. They might be resilient at one time of their life, but then it might not be so resilient at another time of their life. And sometimes it's kind of like how many different traumas they had, kind of, or traumatic events and different stressors they have in their lives, and the will kind of determine how resilient they are. And so so can anybody think of what you've seen with yourself or clients where they kind of like were really, really resilient in the situation? And what creates resilience? Would be a better
I
question.
think sometimes it's kind of hard to distinguish. Oh, I was gonna say, sometimes it might be hard to distinguish between resiliency and people who have become desensitized. So it might appear sometimes that they have become resilient because it seems like they're going through something, you know what I mean, and adapting to it. But in some ways, it might have gotten to the point where they have become desensitized, or they maybe even have disassociated from it and they're not even dealing with it at all. So I think that that's kind of hard to determine.
How do you think you determine whether a person is resilient or they've just been desensitized? What within the person would you see as a difference?
When we talk about desensitization, it's a sense of no, like, oh, okay, well, this happened, and okay, I'm just gonna move on. It's more or less like it can almost be interpreted as a I don't care type thing, or I don't have any feelings about the situation. So when you talk about resilience also comes from dealing with different situations. There are some people who are more well adjusted to change and things happening, so they can develop resiliency. They always liken it to a child, like children. They say that children are really resilient, because they have the ability to bounce back quickly from things, or they adapt quickly. So, when you're desensitized, it's like, okay, well, this happened, so we're gonna move on. And it can be construed as it can be misconstrued as a thing where a person doesn't care or they have no feelings.
Yeah. In my own head is like the difference between desensitized. If a person just kind of falls into like the extreme apathy, they kind of have apathy about everything. They don't care about anything. It's not only the situation that they stop caring about, it was all different aspects of their lives. And that's where I think there's a difference between resiliency, because sometimes it's like, hey, like one coping mechanism of resiliency is looking at like, this is a situation, I can't do nothing with it, so why am I upset about it? I'm not gonna gain any more. I'm not gonna gain nothing by being upset about it, being mad about something which I have zero control of. And that, I mean, and that's not really it's like it might be like, hey, I no longer care about it, but that's kind of like, hey, that's actually kind of a positive coping mechanism, is not getting upset about a situation you can do nothing about.
I'm just thinking about situations, take violence. We have so much violence in Chicago. But it's not, I think there's a lot of individuals that have become desensitized to the violence, to hearing gunshots, to witnessing acts of violence. But that, I don't think it necessarily always reflects, because you can have people still dressing nicely, driving nice cars, feeling, just going, I don't know if you would say that's desensitizing or resiliency, because it's going on around them. They might be going forward in their life. Some people, they might be going forward in a negative way, some in a positive way, but sometimes you just you know, you do start to block it out. You do become desensitized because it becomes normal, you know, and you normalize something that's not normal. And I don't know, I think that's a real slippery slope. And it appears that you're dealing with it well. You know what I mean? You look at a lot of people, you know, that are in areas with high violence, you know, would appear like they're okay, but really not.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Did anybody else have any what's the difference between resilience and because one of the main factors of a person being resilient is feeling that they have support. Is the ability to deal with stuff, is the ability to feel like they have support, they're cared for in the world and stuff like that. So so that's like one of the main so I think with that I'm just trying to process the example you just gave, Liz. It's sort of like if a person is so resilience is still the stressor may still be there. So the stressor is still there, which would be still the gunshots, but the difference would be that if the persons feel like, hey, there's nothing I can do about the situation, but I still have love and support, then I can handle it, which would be kind of interesting.
Or they have like an outlet to work through it. Like they might have like a therapist or a friend that they can like talk to about like living in that area maybe, or that understands what they're going through, or that they have coping skills such as maybe working out or something. Because it's one thing if that type of stuff's going on a lot and you might, you know, just not care, but it's almost like you need to be able to release your feelings still if you do have feelings about it. And that's why you kind of need some sort of, you know, support system in a way so that you can kind of process things that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have a tendency to normalize abnormal situations in order to cope with them. And that, you know, maybe it's good on a micro level for yourself because you can push through, but then on a macro level, as we see, you know what I mean, as it then expands, you know, through the community or through society. So that can be very dangerous when you start to normalize abnormal situations.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to add that right now, I think that the COVID-19 virus, that would be a definite, like we are showing a high level of resilience in being able to navigate this for the last 7, 8, 9 months. So I think we're all examples of resilience in a sense because we're still doing what we need to do. However, there's still a, you know, like a stress. And we all, I'm quite sure, have suffered from some type of vicarious trauma through other people having dealt with the virus. And I know personally I've lost quite a few. Well, not quite a few, I won't say that like that, but I've known people who have passed because of the virus. So I think that would be a good example of the resiliency and how we can identify how we're dealing with it.
Absolutely. And I think that has some degree to why we wanted to do this presentation, to make sure that, you know, we are the whole self-care thing, taking care of ourselves, that we have this support system as coworkers so that we can be the best to the residents that we work with. So thank you for that.
Excellent. Okay, is there any questions or anything about anything?
Okay, Model 5, cumulative toll and care objective. To define and discuss burnout, vicarious and secondary trauma, to identify tools and strategies for self-care at the individual, family, organizational, and structural levels, and to discuss workplace resources and areas of improvement.
So what I'll be sending out soon, it would be the self-care inventory activity, which is just kind of some people have done it before, but it's just kind of a good thing that is having in your desk or whatever, and just do every couple weeks. And what it does is what it kind of makes you kind of a little bit more aware of how you're taking care of yourself. Because sometimes when you're going through a lot of trauma and stress and stuff, you don't realize the role that it's actually having on you. Like all of a sudden you might realize, oh, I didn't really do anything fun. I didn't do anything. I haven't been healthy eating. I haven't been doing anything on my weekends. It could be like you can kind of like you get kind of stressed out. So sometimes you just don't do things what used to be pleasurable activities. And I'll send that out later on today for you guys can get a copy of it. So part of dealing with stress is having awareness, balance, and connection in your life. And what this is being kind of in tune with yourself, is like being aware, like Whitney always does on the Wednesdays with Whitney, does like the kind of the meditation thing at the end. And it's kind of, and that's called like different mindfulness. Is this kind of being aware of like, hey, how is my body functioning? What does my body feel like? Because a lot of times, have you ever noticed when you get like if you get like really mad or something, sometimes you lose feelings in different or there's a lot of stuff going on and you're going through a lot of stuff at the same moment, you might not even realize like your feelings. So like let's say you got really mad and you hit something, you might not even realize you broke your hand. It can be like it kind of like creates a disconnect. And same with people who takes cuts themselves. It's kind of like it's a lot of times when they're going through a lot of stress and stuff, they just have the cutting sometimes makes people kind of feel. And that's some people have told me that's why they cut. And it's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. The other thing is bringing balance in your life is kind of like making sure that you have a wide range of activities that you're doing, that you're not neglecting one part of your life. Because sometimes if you might get totally focused on work, you might neglect your social life or your family life. And it's like it's about creating kind of a sphere where all these different aspects of your life is connected, and connecting to yourself is the last part, and that's kind of like making sure that you have purpose to your life. How are you bringing your purpose to your life? What are things what's providing your anchor? Who is important in your life? Are you feeling connected with them? Are you having those conversations with them? Oops. And does anybody have any questions about that part? Okay, I think this is the last module, I believe.
Okay, module 6, TI approach. Objectives to understand trauma-informed principles and values. Okay, a universal approach to being trauma-informed. This is the 5 S's, do no harm. So create a safe environment, provide supportive relationships, model and support effective self-regulation and coping strategies, develop strengths and resilience, and encourage and practice self-care and collective care. And I think this one's so great because you can think about it as in, your home life, all those things, but also like our work life together, like making sure you feel safe and that we support each other and that we're taking care of ourselves. So I think it's important, all 5 of those.
So it's kind of up to us to change the system and culture. So it's kind of realizing that stress in ourselves are real and it's not a sign of weakness. So often we look at like, hey, what kind of stresses are we going through? And it's hey, I'm not coping well with this stress. I might be drinking too much or doing negative behaviors, and people just don't realize, hey, these are the stress, and that stresses are real, and there are different ways to cope with that other than doing other activities. And the impact of trauma and adversity related to our workforce, organizations, and those we serve. So recognizing like, hey, different behaviors might not be caused by that person having a diagnosis or whatever. It could just because they might have been going through a lot of trauma. A lot of times might get clients who act really kind of aggressive to us, unnecessary, but that might be how they kind of like, they might went through a lot of things in their lives, what they had to act aggressive. And so now that it's might be at a different point in their lives, they still have that same way of interacting. And respond, being integrating knowledge into policies, practices, and everyday work. And sometimes it's just kind of like good to take like in your work stations or whatever, take a break. Have things around your office what kind of inspires you. Like I'm not sure if everybody's seen Donna office, but one thing about Donna, when the last time I went over there, is that you have like a lot of really kind of inspirational quotes and stuff and positive things. And kind of like having an environment that you live in, which is a positive, or not live in, but work in, which kind of brings you it gives a positive vibe. And that's why it's like sometimes just having a workspace what you feel comfortable with. But on the flip side, you got to make sure that your clients feel comfortable, because sometimes I feel comfortable in a messy area. But you got to kind of keep it it's not messy. And also resist re-traumatization is kind of like making sure that when clients are having difficulty, that you're not adding to the environment. So it could be like kind of like not raising your voice with clients and coworkers and different things like that, making sure that you are not intensifying a situation what doesn't need to be intensified. Okay. Is there any questions about that section? Okay, so the final reflection of all the things that we discussed today, identify one that you will do in the next 3 months to strengthen or incorporate trauma-informed care into your workplace. So how could HHCD become more of a trauma-informed workplace? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Would you repeat that, Steve?
How could hosting human capital development become more of a trauma-informed workplace? What could we do better with each other, with ourselves?
I think one thing that we're starting to do, what we're going to do, we already have in place rather, and that's the coffee and chat or the lunch and chat, where we're going to be, kind of getting to know each other and that way we can check in on each other. I think that's a start.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Perfect. Yep. And another way is just having like those bi-weekly meetings. That's actually, in a way, it's giving us a chance to talk and a chance to hear about what's happening. That kind of falls under kind of feeling more connected to your workplace. And a lot of times, this is like one thing I see. I think what we are doing better here is just checking up on each other. It's just calling each other and saying like, hey, what's going on? What are you doing and stuff like that? And also helping out when people have different things what they need to do. I feel like HHCD does a really good job stepping up to help each other. Like different initiatives and stuff like that. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Well, I guess what I was just gonna say, I just kind of came up with this is how we can best bring these topics or connect these topics with our residents. Because I don't think we have any residents on this, which is okay. But Steve and I were talking about maybe because it said trauma-informed care, they didn't really know what it was about or if it was for them. So we want to be able to educate our residents in this type of knowledge too, or so they know they can come to us too if they're going through stuff. So I think it's important to figure out the best way to connect with our residents so that they know that we're here to support them too.
Okay, excellent. Well, anybody have anything else to add? No? Okay, guess that will end this meeting then. Okay, thanks for everybody for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Participating.